Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Daniel Levine. Okay, well, today we have a special guest, Yehudah Pryce. Yehudah is the Senior Program Director of National Mental Health Program. He runs a podcast called Trauma Informed LA. His biography would probably take the entire length of this podcast, so I don't really have enough time to get into it, but hopefully a lot of that will come out during his story. Yehudah, welcome to J Life with Daniel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Been hearing your podcast, and thank you for inviting me.
This is a lot of fun, and also, always happy to talk with a fellow Irvine Jew. It's a nice little community here in our little shtetl in Orange County. So before we get into any of the projects that you're currently involved in and sort of how that shapes your view in the world, what's your background? What sort of brought you here? How did you end up, working for all these different organizations revolving around mental health, addiction, criminal justice, etc.?
Well, it's hard to tell you my background without just going into the heart of it, I would say. And so my life has been framed by my experience in prison. I was arrested as a teenager, sentenced to 24 years in prison, and I got recently released in 2018, October 22nd to be exact. It was a little bit over, I only had to do a little bit over 16 years in prison, and so I was released early in 2018. My release date is technically supposed to be 2023. While incarcerated, I guess you didn't ask a specific Jewish question, so I will hold off on that. But once upon me getting released, I kind of said, how can I use my background, my life experience to impact others, deter them from going down my particular path. Maybe a little teshuva, a little redemption on my part by, going down this path as well. I obviously knew that with my background, I wasn't going to get a banking job or whatnot. So I figured social work.
Listen, I have a lot of friends in banking jobs and they're all very bored. So I think you went the right direction.
Okay. So social work, I figured social work was the path for me. I had earned associate's arts degree inside prison in sociology, social behavioral sciences with an emphasis in social welfare. And what happened is I was 21 units shy upon getting released from prison. Mm-hmm. The reason I was 21 units shy was because there was no real way to pay for my college once inside. I believe it was a 94 crime bill that didn't allow for, any state funding of people who were incarcerated education. So I had my family pay for a class here and there instead of buying me clothes or food packages, hygiene packages, which we were allowed to get once every quarter. And then I was 21 units shy. Again, I was only earning 11 cents an hour while in prison, so I definitely couldn't afford a full slate of classes like I would want to. So I was 21 units shy when I got released in October 2018. I immediately enrolled in the 21 units I needed to graduate with my bachelor's, and so that next semester, January in 2019 is when I started the next semester. I graduated in May of 2019 after completing those 21 units and the internship I did at Beit Shuvah, which is a Jewish residential addiction treatment center. And then I said, okay, now I got, I'm eligible now to enroll for my Master's of Social Work degree. And so I did that at the University of Southern California. I entered that particular program in August of 2019. Around the same time, I went from washing dishes. I had limited job options when I got out of jail to a program manager, ICMS program manager, Intensive Case Management Services, and it was in South Los Angeles. I helped primarily people who were chronically homeless with high acuity mental health challenges. I did that while doing my Master's Social Work program. Then I became an intern therapist, psychotherapist at Beit Shuvah under the founder, Harriet Rosetto. She's my clinical supervisor. She's still my clinical supervisor to this day for a host of other things that I'm doing. I did that. I graduated. I fast-tracked everything. I graduated in 2020 of December, and I immediately applied for my doctorate program at Simmons University. I got accepted, and I started that in January of 2021. Since I had my master's degree, I was able to actually apply for a clinical social worker position, and I started working at the Young Adult Court in Orange County. Young Adult Court, it's one of 8 such collaborative courts in the country. It was started off by Professor Beth Kaufman of UCI. It's a pilot program. It has a research component, and essentially, it's a program for the TAY population, transitional age youth. That's ages 18 to 25. If they are arrested for particular felonies, right? It's not, certain level of violence, gang involvement, sex offenses are not necessarily included in that. But if they have a qualifying crime, I'll go inside the county jails. I'll do a suitability assessment. If they're eligible for the program, they will get released. I will work with them on mental health interventions, transportation, education, job development. If they graduate from the program within 18 months, 18-month minimum, they'll have their case fully dismissed. And if anybody knows about the incarceration system, our criminal justice system, I call it criminal legal system because justice can be subjective, very subjective, depending on how you're looking at it. The collateral consequences of having a jail record, having a felony record, kind of impacts your ability to get a job, housing, licenses for certain professions. So by eliminating that, I think this gives a pathway for a lot of transitional age youth to truly have a chance at life. And so that's the work I'm doing.
I have so many questions about the criminal legal system. As you put it, before we go there, you hinted, that there was a intersection of Judaism at some point there. What role does Judaism have, both in terms of how you view your work now and how did that start?
Yeah, so Judaism, which one wouldn't imagine, you go to jail and then you find the urge to convert to Orthodox Judaism. I found that urge. So I would say I was raised nominally Christian, nominal in the sense that there was not a lot of talk about JC, more so on Christmas or Easter we go to church.
Sure.
It was it's more part of the culture of kind of being an American. My mom was raised Muslim actually in Sri Lanka, came over here, converted to Christianity. My father was raised in Jamaica, raised a Christian, and that was my sort of background. I went to jail, and I figured, so jail is an environment very confrontational. Who figure, right? Mm-hmm. You lock up a lot of people, keep them away from their family and friends, and put them in a cage, and they might get a little bit confrontational if they weren't confrontational before that. And so people were always questioning and challenging people who held on to a belief system that wasn't tied to some sort of criminal ethos. So I'm like, well, I'm Christian, and since Christian has an eternal component to it as well, it makes sense that I, look more into it to defend myself. So I got the Catholic Study Bible in, just because, not Catholic because I was raised Catholic per se, but because it had extra books for me to study. So if I was going to get a good overview of what I'm supposed to be clinging onto or professing, then I wanted all the books to make that sort of argument, if not just to others, but also to myself. I read, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And it wasn't just my rejection of Christianity specifically. I studied other religions too, so more so maybe academically. So I read the Quran front to back, studied some Buddhism, different forms of Christianity, and I just said, religion's not for me. I probably had harsher views of religion, even that, right? Not that I'm a fan of Karl Marx, but at the time, I latched onto a statement that, religion was opium of the masses, and I also felt people incarcerated, you always hear the stereotypes, they become born-again Christian or some sort of religious awakening, and I felt like, okay, maybe I'll change my life, but I don't want to do it through religion. So I kind of made it my point to try to work on myself without religion. Now, lo and behold, they hired a rabbi. I was in Pelican Bay State Prison. That was the first prison that they sent me to. It's a level 4 maximum security prison. They hired a rabbi more so because, I'm not sure, are you familiar with the kosher programs in prison?
I'm not.
So, big controversy, right? So they, there's a court ruling. They have to supply kosher food to people incarcerated. Now, there's a whole bunch of things connected to that, but once they implemented it, a lot of people wanted to be on a kosher program, white supremacists and everything else, right? It wasn't relegated to just Jews with a sincere religious belief. And so also, the court ruling or however it worked was that if they didn't have a rabbi that kind of oversee the program at the particular prison, you can petition to transfer to another prison.
Interesting. Okay.
So we're in Pelican Bay State Prison, and nobody wanted to be there. It's like on the border of Oregon, Crescent City. So you're like, if you're in California, more than likely, you're not anywhere by your family, especially if you're from Southern California. So people were putting this petition in, no rabbi up here, transfer me. So, the powers that be at Pelican Bay State Prison said, not so fast, we're going to hire a rabbi. Right, so they hired a rabbi. He's a Reformed rabbi called Rabbi Joseph Hamfel. Great man, one of the most quality human beings I've ever met. Especially at that time, I hadn't, at least consciously, been open and receptive to very considerate and quality human beings. And so I went there to argue with him because, I was still steeped into that
you also didn't realize for a rabbi coming to argue with him is like, he hit the gold mine there.
Yes, I felt like I was outgunned, and I was outgunned just by sheer class, or maybe it was what Judaism is, right? And so the way he answered me, when I went there and I said, and I went to go critique, so you believe this, how do you believe that? Or am I supposed to accept this, right? Insert whatever you have an issue with religion and Judaism in particular, insert it in that space. And he said, well, for one, we're not trying to really convince anybody, right? If you're not Jewish, then you don't have to be Jewish. Be a good person, believe in, one God. I'm not going to totally limit how that conception of that one God is. Yeah. Just be a good person. That's the main thrust of it. I'm like, all right. But so do you believe this, and that? And he followed up with, you know what? Maybe it doesn't work for other people, but if you look at the history of the Jewish people, Judaism has worked for the Jewish people. And that sort of, I don't want to say it's a soft sell, because I don't necessarily think he was selling it to me, right? Mm-hmm. He was kind of like, hey, this option's over you. You're in jail. You want to come up and hear some good stuff that will nourish your soul or help you, have a different sort of view of behaviors in general, come on in. And so it took me aback because I did all the studying. I mentioned I did all the studying of different religions, and I always heard about Judaism or the Jewish people, but through the lens of other people, right? Through the lenses of other people is what I heard. And so I'm like, fair enough, right? If I'm going to be critical, hypercritical like I am of religions, I've done a lot of research in other religions. Why not just, do it for Judaism? And so it was with the intention, not necessarily to change my particular ways or the direction I was going, but kind of just, get some exposure to a different culture and found out new ways I could argue with yet another religion, right? And maybe even so, if I could somehow, right, maybe in the back of my mind, right, if I could somehow delegitimize this particular religion, I could do a 3-for-1 and delegitimize Christian and Islam at the same time, right? Exactly. So that was really... it wasn't. I don't necessarily. I had the best intentions, but I started studying. He gave me a book, and I was, in Pelican Bay. I'm in lockdown, for the majority of the day, every day, and so I was reading a book, 1 to 2 days, but I soon fell in love, and I don't know what it was. I think Dr. Jordan Peterson mentions that God in the highest sense. Is the spirit you emulate in which to thrive, right? And so I look at it as that one's being in this world. If you could recognize the spirit that allowed one to thrive in this world in the most optimal way, I seen that in Judaism, right? And you could look at it as spirit, God, or how you want to look at it, right? Because I could get super spiritual or Kabbalistic, or biologically speaking, you could look at that spirit as a pattern, right?
Sure.
All right, and intuitively speaking, I recognize that pattern within Judaism, as a sort of animating principle, and I gravitated towards that, and I just started slowly molding my ways into all things Jewish. I ended up transferring to another prison. I spent a short time with him, so it was kind of just like an introduction to Judaism, and then I left him, and I went to another prison. There was no rabbi there. I was there for less than a year. This was in Lancaster. Then I went to California Men's Colony, which is in San Luis Obispo.
And just to, to ask, I guess, a tangential question, but just sort of popped into my head. How does it work in terms of transfers? Is that your choice? Is that sort of the system deciding that you should be moved? I mean, how does that work?
That's a good question. the initial prison you usually go to a reception center. So I went to Wasco State Prison. It's like a 3-month reception center when you go to prison. And then you put in your recommendations of where you would like to go, and then they send you wherever they want to send you. So I literally told everybody, like, I don't really care where they send me, just not to Pelican Bay. And so that's where they sent me. After that, right, if you they could send you wherever they want to. You have less control if you get into trouble and they have to send you to a higher security prison. But also, if you're locked up in a cell, for years, and there's limited programming, and you manage just to not get in any trouble, maybe part of it has to do because you're just locked in a cell for a lot of time. You could get to a lower level, and it's usually you pick 2 different choices, and you can go to those 2 different choices. Usually that's how it works. So that's what happened. I went to Lancaster because it was closest to Orange County, and then after that I picked San Luis Obispo, even though it was farther away, for a level 3. It was a level 3 prison. It was one of the closer ones too, and I know they had programming there, and I heard that they had a Jewish community there. Okay. So a larger Jewish community than I had. They didn't have a minyan at Lancaster, so they didn't even have services there. So this was going to be different for me.
Okay, so you get to San Luis Obispo, and how does Jewish community work in prison? I mean, you're talking about a minyan. Are there scheduled davening times? Is there a morning seder? I mean, how does it work?
Yeah, so it's there's different, I guess, perspectives, I would say. So my experience are different experiences. So Jews that present as white, and I say that in because I don't necessarily believe there's such thing as a white Jew, because I believe that Jews have typically been the number one enemy of white supremacy, right? And these are America's color-coded constructs, don't necessarily need to be grafted onto Jewish identity, since Jewish identity precedes these color-coded racial constructs. But in prison, in that particular reality, it does matter. So if you present as white, everything is super racialized or hyper racialized inside prison. So if you're black, you're gonna have to fall up under the black car, right? If you're white, you're gonna fall up under the white car, right? Which they identify as the Peckerwoods, and the whites are usually ran by some sort of skinhead neo-Nazi, right? And so if you're Jewish, you present as white, you're gonna follow up under this card ran by your enemy, right? Like the enemy of the Jewish people, right? So for a lot of Jews that could present as white or pass as white, there was a minimizing of their identity. Right, at least at the higher security prisons. When you get to lower security prisons, there might be a little more wiggle room. There's still those sort of affiliations that you have to be a part of, but nonetheless. So it's a different experience. So I'm with the black card, but I have the kind of the freedom. Nobody's gonna say, hey, what are you doing with the Jewish stuff? There was comments. Don't get me wrong. There was comments. There's very militant type of movements inside prison in the black car and in other cars.
And when you say cars,
that's what they call it. Okay. I don't necessarily know the origin of why they call it a car. They also say like the person in charge of that car, right, the shot caller, so to speak, would have the keys, right? So I'm going with this analogy, right? So maybe they just I don't know, right? I came into this system and I just try to navigate it the best way I could. But so they call it car. Our cars in plural, and so it's part of the black car. But don't get me wrong, within the black car, there's other cars, right? And so you have Crips, Bloods. Then within the Crips, you have neighborhood Crips, Compton Crips, there's gangster Crips. There's a whole bunch of different So it's a perilous scene you have to navigate just for survival. I think it kind of and we could touch on that later. I think it informs some of my social work, just understanding that. The trauma of being in a constant state of anxiety or preparedness, right? And just for an example, I remember being in Pelican Bay State Prison and hearing my skinhead next door neighbors sharpening up knives, knowing that something happened on the yard between blacks and whites, and so the next time they open up a cell, whatever black cell, whatever white cell they open up, they're going to go at it. And if you choose to be like, I'm a religious guy, I don't want to have anything to do with it, and you don't participate, and it's a racial thing, then your racial group will attack you probably worse than that situation would have happened. So I remember those those knives being sharpened, and I remember like, all right, so I need to make a knife and sharpen it, but I got multiple strikes, so if the correction officers catch me with this knife, then I could get life. If I fight, they have Mini 14 rifles, I could easily get shot. A lot of times when there's these sort of fights involved, a black person ends up shot. I don't know the reasons behind that, but nonetheless, so that's a possibility too. And then also too, I'm looking at these guys, right? 250 pounds, right? Even with a knife, I don't weigh that much, right? You can't see me on this podcast, right? I'm like 170, right? So I'm like, even it is ugly. And so those sort of situations present themselves on a constant basis, and right. And so that it's very very traumatizing, that sort of scenario. So I could imagine for a Jew who could present as white, having to hide one's identity and maybe further the cause of one's hidden identity, the enemy of one's hidden identity, right, and one's family members, right. But for me, I had a lot more wiggle room to kind of explore, and they actually had a rabbi there, Rabbi Lon Moskowitz, another great human being. He attended my wedding virtually. I know I'm not taking this narrative in a linear fashion and jumping all over the place, but nonetheless,
no, it's great.
And so we had they had different services at different times available. I say minyan. They weren't so concerned about a minyan. It wasn't necessarily orthodox, heterodox. And I was eventually made the lead clerk of the Jewish chapel.
Okay.
And so I was in charge of like Jewish programming. I don't necessarily say it's a joke, but I claim until I'm refuted that I had the first Zionist course in California state prisons. I did Zionism 101.
I love that.
And opened it up. And trust me, there were some nice, robust arguments, but I don't think a lot of people had exposure to these arguments previously. You kind of just, go with your gut feeling of
what's the market. I mean, as somebody who on a very, very different level, is always coming up with classes and trying to get people interested. What's the marketing like for a Zionism 101 in prison?
Well, I'll put it like this, right? You just need to really put Zionism 101 on a flyer, right? And people are going to come like, all right, what's going on there in the Jewish chapel? What are they doing over there, right? So, and people know me. I'm always open to. I don't like to call it arguments, but a robust discussion, right?
Yeah.
That's different. Is like you could totally disagree with somebody, right? But I like what President Biden said back in the day before he was president. Is like I never doubt the intentions of the other side, right?
I like that.
And so, and I think that's like a Jewish concept too.
100%.
Give everybody the benefit of the doubt. So coming with to at least to understand, right? Because even if you could disagree and you could point out the reasons why you disagree and why you believe somebody else is wrong. To feel like, at least in their mind, they're coming from a good place, and how do you connect with them on some commonalities or at least some understanding. So they knew me that, and I'm still the same person that not necessarily confrontational as much anymore, but it was a work in progress. That I was open to these sort of robust dialogues, and so a lot of people came, and there was robust dialogues, right? But I also give them a background as to what Zionism truly is, right? At least in my eyes. And a lot of the founders' eyes. So I was in charge of these sort of programming in there, and I was in charge of the Jewish library where the rabbi said, all right, what books do we need? And so that's kind of when I went the Orthodox route after, a bit of studying and a bit of exposure, knowing what connected with me the most. And so, again, in short order, wasn't necessarily a minyan. Services for all the Yom Tovim, the religious holidays, Shabbos, we might have a evening service, and might have an afternoon service. Maybe wasn't perfectly on the right times because correctional officers are not concerned about halakhic.
About his money.
Yeah. For whatever reason, I don't know why. But so it was a unique experience. It definitely was a unique experience, but it started me onto this path that I'm here today.
That's incredible. And so how much, wow, there are so many different directions that this can go in. So that was such a fascinating insight. To what extent does Judaism play a role into sort of what you then wanted to do subsequently out of prison in terms of really taking your experience and going and really just trying to cause as much good as possible in the world, through all the different things you're involved in?
Well, if you look how Judaism's structured, it's not just like a individual endeavor where you seek enlightenment for yourself and you're content with that, right? It's very family, community oriented. And to me, I didn't necessarily grow up in a cohesive community So I knew the work that it wouldn't just be about me improving myself, but it would be me working on improving myself so that I could more fully participate in a community and and build a family, and then I work in concentric circles. So it starts with myself, it starts with my family, community, and then to the sort of the wider community. So again, I didn't really have exposure to anything Jewish consciously prior to my incarceration. I didn't think I consciously knew any Jews, like meaning that I met somebody and I knew that person was Jewish. I remember my mom saying, "Well, you were delivered by a Jewish doctor. You didn't know, or your allergy doctor was Jewish." Yeah, like, I didn't know they were Jewish, right? I guess in retrospect it makes sense, right? So it was more of like I imagined that Judaism was going to help me change my behavior while I was inside, and then I could start a family, be part of a community, engage in the community in a way that is helpful or whatever way, because I didn't necessarily know, I couldn't truly envision or imagine what my life would be like as a Jew, since I didn't really know what life was like since I got arrested as a teenager, what it would be like for me getting out of jail after 16 years, let alone being Jewish. But I knew that those core principles would somehow be channeled through social work.
Wow. So you had said something before that I want to come back to. You said you don't like calling it the criminal justice system because justice, the connotation is justice isn't always played out. And I'm thinking, this podcast will probably come out sometime during the high holidays, probably between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And just thinking of a lot of Jewish sources on justice, right? There's the famous Midrash where God initially wanted to create the world, Midat Hadin, from a strict, judgment, and then God saw that the world wasn't going to be able to survive, and so he had to introduce the Midat HaRachamim, mercy, and sort of fuse them. And so the Jewish view in terms of, God and theology and teshuvah, and then also subsequently, I would argue, in how to run a society, is that you always need both, right? You always need sort of the judgment and also the mercy. Whereas it seems like from this connotation that, there's so many things to say about the American legal system, but it seems like it definitely doesn't have that. I'm just struck by both the generalities and the specifics. How does somebody get sentenced to 20 plus years for a nonviolent anything, really, when they're a teenager? Even starting there.
Yeah. No, I hear you. So one, let me preface, I don't want to minimize my criminality or the actions by, putting that qualifier of nonviolent. It was a robbery, so by the nature of robberies, I could understand the consideration that it's violent. I say that more so to when somebody thinks about a quarter century in prison, right? They think, oh, somebody must have got seriously injured, right? There's no physical, emotional, psychological injuries, right? It was a robbery. They give me 4 years for the robbery. 10 years because they said it was for a benefit of a gang, right? Then 10 years because they said a gun was displayed. So right, that's how we got the 24-year sentence. They've reformed some of those laws, so now the judge has some discretion. They didn't have it back in the day. But I think there's a misconception that somehow that justice can be seen as how many years you're incarcerating somebody for, right? That's how you kind of conceptualize justice, and so that's probably one of my biggest issues. And to this point, right, no matter what I did in prison to kind of change myself, when I went before that parole board in 2018, the district attorney, same district attorney's office that I technically work with right now to help to help people that kind of were walking in my same sort of shoes, that office sent a district attorney up to the parole board and argued against my release, saying I was a threat to public safety, right? But this is not something unique about me. This is generally what district attorneys do, right? So it's kind of like you gave somebody a sentence, right? Like, are they not redeemable? Like, what sort of benefit to society besides just locking people away? So after the 1970s, I know that there was this what they call mass incarceration started happening, right? That's when it went from a limited amount of prisons to the prison boom, particularly in California, right? And this is supposed to be a super blue state, super progressive, and yet we have the largest, prison population in the country, right? So mass incarceration was achieved in a bipartisan ways, and specifically, I would like to say that if you're thinking about it in terms of public safety, and so I'm a big proponent, and that's kind of what I'm doing my doctorate projects on is smart incarceration. So what is that? That is not like an abolitionist framework, though, you know, I definitely understand the want or the desire to radically transform systems and create sort of utopian framework for people to thrive in. I definitely understand that sort of desire, but smart incarceration is in terms of public safety as well, right? Mm-hmm. And so I look at it as, okay, you could lock somebody up for a couple decades in prison, right? Specific to particular communities, right? Because it disproportionately affects, you know, black populations and other particular populations who are historically marginalized. That if you take a person out, right, it's, you know, and we're talking about a large part they're men, right? You know, 90% of people incarcerated are men. Mm-hmm. That if you take that person out of the family unit, right, that person's connected to, they have brothers, sisters, they have children, right? They might have spouses, girlfriends, right? You take that person, that creates dysfunction in those sort of, you know, family structures and the communal structures. And imagine if you have communities that have such a high rate of their males being incarcerated, right? That's going to cause dysfunction on a communal family level. That's going to lead to more crime, higher utilization of social services, mm-hmm. and whatnot, right? And so if we could try to, you know, think of terms of public safety in a way that doesn't discard that person as being, you know, forever irredeemable, right? Then I think we can make some real change and kind of. There's a overwrought used term, I believe, is equity, right? But we can create more equitable societies in that societies who have been historically disenfranchised are not continued down that particular cycle, you know, in this perpetuating cycle that leads to more crime and leads to greater threats to public safety. And since these historical marginalized populations have face this, you know, at the point of arrest, at the point of how much time they're getting, and the consequences they receive on probation and parole once they get released from jail. That's why I say it's not justice if you look at it like that. It might be somebody's vision of justice, right? But it's a legal system. I don't attach justice to this, nor do the majority of people populating historically marginalized communities.
No, for sure. I mean, it almost seems like from some perspective that this is sort of the banality of evil being propagated just through bureaucracy, meaning like it's just like this is how the system's always worked, and, you know, every single person along the stage is very narrowly focused and limited, and they just do the next thing, and then there's no one inside the system. I mean, hopefully that's changing politically, but there's nobody thinking big picture, you know, what are we doing? You know, are we putting people in prison because we want to help wider society? Well, this obviously isn't going to do it, because exactly what you just said. Are we putting people in prison because we think it's going to be beneficial for the person? Well, probably not. Are we putting people in prison because we think, you know, they objectively deserve some punishment, and, you know, the gods of justice, you know, I'm being facetious here, you know, want them to be? You know, probably not. So what is it? Is this just sort of bureaucracy not able to be stopped once it's sort of unleashed?
I think there's a knee-jerk reaction in a lot of people that they hear about crime and they believe that should be punished. And a lot of people haven't had those robust dialogues that I mentioned where, mm-hmm. like, hey, do you understand the full consequences? Maybe if you don't live in these particular communities, right, you can't, you know, really conceptualize or really see, right? When I go, if I'm in South LA or South Central LA or whatnot, and I'm having, you know, conversations with people and whatnot, that person may have a cousin, a brother, you know, an uncle, a father in jail. It's real, right? It's not some abstract thing, right? So a person wants to know what is best for, because I know my uncle, my father, my brother, you know, my cousin. I know them better than a bureaucracy, a system knows them, right? I know what could probably be better for them, right? And so, but I think there's this sort of disconnect for so many people that they don't have so many family members, or historically speaking, they don't come from communities like where this is a real reality, and you can't just say lock them up and throw away the key, because now you see these children with no father around, right? And so that's why I say it's bipartisan, because if you're strong about like family values, communal integrity, right, then you have to understand, right, or at least should be able to consider what happens if you just take all the male figures out of a community or within a man. What's that going to do to public safety, right?
And then it's a repeating cycle.
Yeah,
you know, which,
for sure.
Yeah, it's terrible. I sort of had my I don't want to say awakening. I mean, I remember this so distinctly when I was in grad school. This is maybe 7 years ago. I was teaching part-time at a community college called Ort in Los Angeles. Okay. And I remember one of the students was a 19-year-old black man who came into class one day and basically asked me to sign some paper. Oh, what is this paper? Oh, I'm forgetting the exact details, but, I'm on parole or, something like that, and I need proof that I'm attending this class. And whatever. And so we started talking and, we hung out. We ended up grabbing coffee and, I asked, well, what landed you in prison? And he said, well, I was caught selling weed. And I remember at the time, I mean, this is, 7-8 years ago in California, the number of friends I had in college and grad school at the time that were selling weed themselves with no even fear that they would be caught or any, I mean, that to me was just such a moment of, oh my goodness. Yeah. I mean, of course, it's such a small data point just in terms of this wider thing, going in that direction just because, to make a generalization, which is generally true, the majority of the American Jewish community probably doesn't have much personal connection to this wider system. What do you think? I mean, I would say both wider American system. I just know the listener of this podcast probably 99% Jewish. What is the Jewish community? What should they know about the criminal legal system? How can they be of help for sort of turning the tide towards good?
So I mean, I think the best thing to do is kind of get familiar with people who've had this sort of lived experience of incarceration, right? I don't call people or this particular population inmates, felons, convicts, probationers, or parolees, right? I like to frame it as community members with incarceration experience, right? Because we're coming back into the community, right? Mm-hmm. It makes the most sense to fully prepare us to thrive within the community because the recidivism rates are so high. That's potential crime that you are eliminating, right? If you are working to kind of integrate people. So a lot of sort of, friendships, conversations, and dialogue. Don't just have the one black friend, right? Figure out ways to, to interact and know more people and expand your worldview. And then maybe your views may change in that regard. I know that it's benefited me a lot by allowing me to rehabilitate, I would say, is the Irvine community specifically. So I could tell you what the Irvine community did for me, and maybe that kind of will answer your question before I just start naming particular organizations. So when I got released from prison, prior to me getting released from prison, I wrote Rabbi Senior at Beth Jacob in Irvine and told him, I'm in jail. Well, actually, I gave him a 14-page from juvenile delinquency to Judaism, and I had Rabbi Moskowitz give me like a email of recommendation as well, so he just didn't think some random guy in prison. Is
this published somewhere?
What the
14 pages?
No, it's not published. I just kind of just send it to him, and I said, "Look, I want to convert. I want to do Orthodox Jewish conversion when I get out of jail. I'm from Orange County, but I didn't necessarily have a particular community because I didn't know any Jewish people, as I mentioned. And so he said, "Oh yeah, the community would love to have you when you get out." I'm like, "All right, I'm in." Right, and so I got out, and so I originally got out. I was released into a halfway house in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, and I was able to leave from there early to go to State Fullerton. Has, I believe, it was the first collegiate housing for formerly incarcerated students in the nation, right? Oh, wow. It's the urban houses. And I was able, I didn't go to State Fullerton, but I was one of the classes of those 21 units. I just took a course at the Fullerton JC, and so I was able to go to their housing. And then from there, I told them, look, I'm planning. I may move to Irvine, so I know this is the greatest deal. I only got to pay a third of my income. I was washing dishes, so my rent was like $8 a month. It's a multi-million-dollar home. So it was good. But they're like, so why do you want to leave? I gotta leave it. I gotta live within walking distance of my shul, so I gotta go to Irvine, right? And they're like, I don't now get me wrong, I had no idea, right? And so one of the things that people are anxious about when they get released from jail are housing. Right? Yeah. And so I didn't know exactly where I was going to live. I remember a friend of mine, well, he wasn't a friend at the time, but just a random guy, because I was going to like Shacharis. I originally started traveling from LA to Shacharis, which is like, 6:30 in the morning. So I had to leave a little bit early to get from LA to there.
You might be the only Jew that goes from LA to Orange County for a Jewish life.
Yeah, this is true, right? In retrospect, for sure. But I met Mark Ellman. I think I accidentally going through the shul door, spilled coffee, cleaned it up. He's like, "Oh, you knew I'm like trying to go to conversion." We exchanged numbers, and I started up a friendship with him. He connected me to a guy by the name of Lee Weissman, a Breslauer. I believe he used to teach at TBT. Mm-hmm. And he had a house here in Irvine, and he's like, all right, look, when I have somebody in here going to UCI when they move out, you're welcome to rent a room. So I'm like, oh, this is great. Like, I just, it's got out of jail for robbery and, a host of other things, did 16 years. And here's somebody saying, yeah, willing to rent a room to you. Right. And so that sort of, a lot of people could say things like slogans or phrases of how they're committed to kind of, ameliorating certain, social disparities or helping people from particular paths. But he put his money where his mouth is, right? And not to say that he even stated he was all about that, right? But he is a living example of somebody who says, like, all right, somebody wants to be Jewish, not even yet Jewish, somebody wants to be Jewish, and more so, or maybe not more so, but that's part of what being Jewish is, wants to be part of the community, right? And he ran a room to me, right? And there was numerous different things of help being provided to me, and most importantly to me, it was modeling appropriate behavior to thrive within society, free society. And so I was invited to Shabbos dinner after Shabbos dinner, right? As you know, it goes, right? I'm walking back from shul on a Shabbos, and people, where are you going? Where you got somewhere to eat? And I'm just getting invited, and I'm seeing these two-parent households, the dynamics between husband and wife and children, right? And I haven't had so many examples of this sort of life, right? Whatever I read in a book, you can't capture what it means to live inside a Jewish family, right? And so I'm seeing that, and one, I think it really touched me deeply to have so many families invite me into their home, right? Somebody that it's not, a lot of people say, oh, did they accept you for being black? That didn't even cross my mind, the racial aspect of it. I have a master status of, a convicted felon, right? That's, to me, that's a lot more, people are much more weary of that than just, any sort of thing that one color of one's skin may signify. And so I was kind of, I had anxiety connected to that, and to be embraced by the community in that particular way and supported, it helped me integrate. And then what it did is also make me feel responsible to community. Prior to me being incarcerated, I felt no responsibility to any particular community. I was an individual that was, finding my way in this world, and obviously my actions affected other people, but I didn't necessarily feel connected to these other people. So it was hard, especially for where my brain was developed at that particular time, to kind of really comprehend or feel, I should govern my actions and behavior accordingly. So being open to supporting, those sort of stories, and I don't know how every community, allows themselves or connects people to those sort of stories, because I know I'm not just a unique story. I may have my own different unique aspects of my particular story, but people coming out of jail, even Rabbi Senior says I wasn't the first one ever that did that. I might have been the first one that completed the conversion program and followed through with that. But there's also specific organizations, right? I'm going to be working for Defy Ventures, right? We help entrepreneurial skills go inside prisons. We call it the Inside Out program. So we help people, 7-month curriculum, 2.5 hours twice a week. There's a mental health component to it. That's why I've been hired. I start on Monday to kind of start standardizing that across the nation, and also kind of help the reintegration process from when released. How does that look like, right? Plugging with people job sources and supporting the interpersonal skills. There's a lot of maladaptive responses people have to survive in prison, which I wouldn't necessarily say is maladaptive, because it helps you thrive while in prison, but they become maladaptive patterns in the free world, right? And so you got to have to adjust. So I'll help with that. There's the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. There's numerous organizations, and you could probably just Google it specifically, that is going to help you. And there might be a local chapter in your community, right? There's organizations on UCI, right? I think it's Underground Scholars. A lot of Cal State colleges have Project Rebound. So there's a whole bunch of different organizations that are really willing to help, and you find in which ways you can feel connected to that, right? And to me, when we think about, when people talk about social disparities, or another often overused term, especially if people are very ambiguous with it, is systemic racism, right? And so I'll look at it as, do systems have a disproportionate impact on particular populations, right? Regardless of the reason why, regardless of the reason why, so what can be done to kind of correct that to have more favorable outcomes, right? And so how do we do that? That's a process, but I feel it starts with community, right? So every community needs to contribute in what ways they can. 100%.
That's a beautiful message. I don't want to take too much of your time, because I know that in addition to working full-time and part-time and being a full-time doctoral student, you're also doing a Hilchot Shabbat program and everything else. So really, thank you so much for making time. Before we close, is there any other comments, any other thoughts, anything that you wanted to discuss that we didn't get a chance on today?
Well, I would like to say the hardest job I have is being a parent of 3 children, so you forgot to include that. Closing thoughts. Well, I just like to thank you for inviting me. I never thought people be interested in myself, because most of my life, the very vast majority of my life, is a life of poor choices. I think going into this Rosh Hashanah, leading up, right, Elul, we're kind of working on ourselves. The king is in the field, right? And to know that no matter how many poor choices you made in your life, right, like, Judaism provides, a path towards that sort of redemption, where you can get right with yourself, get right with God, get right with other people. And I hope so, by kind of my social work, is me trying to get right with other people, right? I feel like God is merciful, and society may not be as merciful as God, and I need to work as hard as possible to bring compassion and mercy into the world, and this is the time to do it. And so,
Amen. Well, Yehudah, thank you so much for coming on J Life with Daniel.
Thank you for having me.